Ever been on a short-term missions trip? Are you familiar with the term short-term missions trip? How about this one? Have you ever heard the term short-term ministry trip? And is there even a difference between a short-term missions trip and a short-term ministry trip? You see, I think there is, and I think the distinction between those two and making it clear will go a long way toward helping the church as a whole and us as individual followers of Jesus get God's heart for reaching all groups of people in the world, or all ethnic groups of people in the world, and making His name great and His salvation known, so His name will be worshiped from the rising to the setting of the sun. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, so let's get going. Ever been on a short-term missions trip? If you have, are these some of the things that you maybe participated in? Building houses, building schools, building latrines, building other types of structures, doing building or automobile maintenance, perhaps providing medical and dental services. What about going out and passing out perhaps food and basic health care and life essential items to people? Is that what you've done on your missions trip? And then the other question is, where did you go? What type of environment did you go to? And here's what I'm meaning. Did you go to areas that were primarily Christian areas already? In other words, the gospel and the message and the story of Jesus were easily accessible to people that lived there. And how do you know this? Did you see a lot of churches while you were there? As you traveled around, as you drove around, did you see a lot of churches that already existed where you were? And if you did, then you were going to a predominantly Christian area of the world. And why does this matter? Because I think this helps us define the difference between a mission trip and a ministry trip, which in the big picture helps the church and we as individual followers of Jesus get a better understanding of where we are working, amongst whom we are working, and acquiring God's heart for the unreached people of the world. But before we get into that, I want to share with you a special thing I have going right now. What I have found that has really helped me to gain God's heart for reaching the unreached, in other words, people unreached being people who will in all probability be born, live, and die, never having access to have the opportunity to hear the story and the message of Jesus. So, what helps me is getting an overall vision or picture or purpose for my life that is aligned with God's heart. And so what I want to do is I'm doing what I call a Northstar 5-day challenge. And so the Northstar is the guiding star, the guiding vision, the guiding purpose for your life. And I'm going to do a 5-day challenge, and it's an individual challenge. So it's just you and I for 5 days, and I will walk you through a process to help you gain this overall vision or purpose that's aligned with God's heart for the next 12 months of your life. I would say for the rest of your life, but that can be overwhelming and things change. So let's just shoot for the next 12 months. It'll just be you and I. It'll be fun. We'll work together. There will be homework, but the cool thing is the homework is done during the call, so there's nothing for you to do in between the calls. There is a cost. It's $20, but before you jump to conclusions there, the $20 doesn't actually come to me. You donate $20 down in the show notes. I'll explain how this Northstar Challenge works. But down in the show notes, there's a list of 3 nonprofit organizations that are aligned with God's heart to reach every ethnic group of people in the world. I support all 3. Donate to one of those. Take a screenshot of the completed donation. Send it to me on the phone or email that's down in the show notes. I'll get in contact with you and we'll get this going. All right, let's get back to the show now. So, what is the difference between a short-term missions trip and a short-term ministry trip? Well, I want to look at something first. God's heart from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22 is about the common thread tying it all together, all those individual stories together. It's about God making his name great and his salvation known in all the world, amongst all groups of people in the world, so that his name will be worshiped 24 hours a day on this earth, and there will be people in heaven from every one of these people groups around the throne in heaven worshiping God forever and ever. And if you get to the Great Commission, which is Matthew 28, 18 through 20, that is a 3-verse short synopsis of Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, which is a short synopsis of God's heart. So, here's what I'm getting at. One more thing, I want to read this out of Romans. This is what Paul wrote out of Romans. He said in Romans 15, 19, the last half of 19 through verse 21, he said, "So that from Jerusalem and all the way around to Illyricum, I have fulfilled the ministry of the gospel of Christ, and thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. But as it is written, those who have never heard, or those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand." Here's my distinction between a short-term missions trip and a short-term ministry trip. A short-term missions trip is one that goes to where the gospel is not prevalent, so we're not working amongst a predominantly Christian culture, and goes with the primary purpose, goes with the primary purpose of sharing the message and the story of Jesus with people. Okay, so a short-term missions trip goes to an area of the world that is not predominantly Christian, where access to Jesus' message and story is not readily available to people, and going with the purpose of sharing the story of Jesus and the message of Jesus with people. A short-term ministry trip is a trip that will go to either a predominantly Christian, normally primarily, or a predominantly non-Christian area, but its purpose is to go and strictly to serve the people. The primary purpose is to go and provide a service, such as building a school, building houses, building latrines, providing medical and dental services, providing basic needs to meet basic needs of the people. That's a short-term ministry trip. Now, I have never heard this term used before. I am trying to use it more frequently and explain it to people, because distinguishing between the purposes of those two trips to me helps people understand the difference between God's mission, which is to make his name great and his salvation in all the world, and loving on people, which is the ministry side of it for the most part. I also think loving on people is sharing the message and the story of Jesus, but we in the church don't think of it that way. So I want to give you 2 real-life examples of how this plays out. I was attending a church, and they were announcing they had some short-term mission trips coming up. And the first one was a trip to Jamaica, and they were going there to work at an orphanage that was run by Christians, and it was a family-oriented event, and you could take your kids and you could go. And the primary purpose was to go build some stuff, and that was it, to do maybe maintenance and provide supplies for the orphanage and stuff like that. Then the second trip they were talking about was a trip to Ecuador. And the guy making the announcement said this, and I probably won't forget this. He said, "Now this one is a real mission trip because we are going to share the gospel." And I thought, how can you call the first one a missions trip when you're not going to share the gospel? But the other one you call a missions trip because you're going to share the gospel. Seems to me that gets very confusing. And I joke, but I think it's true. We have come to the point in our lives, especially in the West, as Christians and churches, that I can go mow my elderly neighbor's yard And I can call that missions. That's not missions, that's ministry. That is serving them out of the love of Christ because they are someone created by God, for God, and in his image. Very needed, but it is not missions. Missions to me is going to where the gospel is not available with the purpose of sharing the story and message of Jesus. So you see the distinction. The second real life example of the difference between ministry and missions is this. My wife and I lived in Honduras for a year and a half. We lived in an orphanage, and I worked with some Honduran pastors to start churches in Honduras. So, Honduras is a already predominantly Christian nation or Christian culture. In other words, they have a lot of churches there. They have a lot of people who consider themselves Christians there. Whether they are or not, we can discuss that later. But the gospel is accessible by the vast, vast majority of people in Honduras. My wife and I, while we were there, people would refer to us as missionaries. And I think it's simply because we had gone to another country as Christians, following what we believed Jesus wanted us to do in going there. One of my goals while I was there was to introduce the pastors that I worked with, who were amazing individuals, and they taught me so much about how to love on people, to help them understand and to help the churches that we worked with in Honduras to understand about the unreached 3 billion people in the world and what they could do to help reach those 3 billion people, while we were starting churches in Honduras in a way that would be transferable to anywhere in the world, specifically to the areas where these 3 billion people live. The point I'm getting at is people referred to us as missionaries, even though I was going to a predominantly Christian culture. I did not consider myself a missionary. I finally just gave in and allowed people to call me a missionary because that's the only term they knew to use to describe me. I considered myself a person doing cross-cultural ministry that I thought is what I was supposed to be doing, what Jesus wanted me to do, and was important, but I don't think I was a missionary. And I think when we're calling people who go to predominantly Christian areas missionaries, I think that muddies the water about what it means to be a missionary who is one, to me, sent out to go to the unreached, like Paul said, to not build on someone else's foundation, but go to where people have never seen or heard or understood the message of Jesus. So that's my soapbox here. Just think about that. When your church is talking about the different trips that they're taking and everything is termed a short-term missions trip, use that filter. What is the primary purpose of going? Is it to share the story and message of Jesus, or is it to provide service to people in the name of Jesus? And the other one is, what is the culture in which we are going? Is it predominantly Christian, or is it predominantly non-Christian? And using those two filters, you can determine, should I think of this as a short-term missions trip, going to share the story and message of Jesus in an area that's not predominantly Christian, short-term missions trip? Or is it a short-term ministry trip, which is going to predominantly Christian area or non-Christian area, but going with the idea of just providing services and serving the people in the name of Jesus? And I think if we will also bring this up to our church leadership, bring this up to other believers that we know, and just point these differences out. I'm not saying one is wrong, one is right. What I'm saying is, let's be honest about what we're doing so we don't make missions me going out to mow my elderly neighbor's yard and calling it missions. It is loving on that person. It is serving that person. It is ministry for my elderly neighbor, but it is certainly not missions, because what happens is, we reduce missions down to the point where I only have to go mow my neighbor's yard and I never have to think about the 3 billion people who are unreached by the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, what am I going to ask you to do? That's what I'm asking you the steps to take. Evaluate what is going on in your church, what you call short-term missions trip, and divide them up between ministry and missions trip, and then just start using this language of short-term missions trip or short-term ministry trip with your friends and your church and see what happens. Hey, if you like this, you think this is a beneficial and valuable, it provides some benefit and some value, how about liking it? How about even sharing it with somebody if you know they might like it? And then finally, if you want to, hit that subscribe button. Hit that subscribe button. Also, if you found it beneficial, how about making a comment about what you found beneficial or what you would like more information about or a question you may have? And if you think I'm totally off my rocker and crazy, that's okay too. If you would just blast me down there in the comments, I would appreciate that too. I won't take it personal. I won't get offended, but it helps me understand how to make better, more valuable videos in the future that will help more people.